In October, after 3 months of siege, lots of people were missing. Just the older and younger remained. That's why I had to go to the front line. I was part of the Ladrera battalion, tasked with the defense of the Postigo schools. We knew that if they entered, they would kill us. The situation in Oviedo for the besieged was desperate. Good morning to everyone. I'm Pep, and this is the Spanish Civil War. In this channel and for the next 3 years, we will follow week by week the Spanish Civil War, its battles, and the Holocaust that it provoked. Last week we saw how, as most of the fronts remained quiet, Franco was proclaimed head of the government of the Spanish state, even if he will refer to himself as head of state. Also last week we saw the Battle of Cabo Espartel, and with it, the end of the blockade of the Strait of Gibraltar and of the first major airlift in history. It was a sort of calm before the storm, as this week we'll see not one but 3 offensives starting. In the center of Spain, the march to Madrid starts. Mola will be the commander-in-chief of this campaign, and as he boasted, he had 5 columns under his command. Now, let's take a closer look at this famous Civil War contribution to the worldwide vocabulary. It appeared in the Republican press for the first time last week, and this week it started to appear in the international press. Most of the sources attribute this sentence to Mola, but it's still not clear. Some attributed it to Capo de Llano, others to Franco. And there's even some who consider it a Republican invention to justify the rearguard massacres. In fact, let's think for a while about the effect that declaration had on the population of Madrid. We talked about the rise in the death toll caused by the Red Terror last week. If we think about a city that is waiting for an assault, Mola's declaration means the opening of a new front in your back. So, even if the Republic has been making efforts, for example, the interrogation and detention centers, in order to stop the Red Terror, now with the menace of the 5th column and the rebel armies heading to Madrid, these institutions will become tools of state repression. We could say that now the institutionalized Red Terror has been born. Remember what we said last week about the anarchist point of view or insight? If you rebuild state institutions, they will serve a repressive role. So, as the chaotic rearguard Red Terror continues, a new institutionalized one will be taking our attention from now on. And both will be bolstered by the idea of having the enemy among its ranks. Even though, we must say, first, that most of the killings related to the Red Terror took place during the first month of the war, and were mostly fruit of the revolutionary chaos that came with the disappearance of the law and order forces. But we will talk more about this as it progresses. Second, the White Terror was much more difficult to estimate because most of the early executions were not registered, and there are still hundreds of mass graves all over the country, as you may see in this map. This White Terror was institutionalized since the beginning and claimed more lives. I'll give you now present Spanish Holocaust numbers about the approximative rearguard death toll during the Spanish Civil War. We will back to it later, as there are other interesting sources. But let's keep in mind that the victors continued murdering. But there are no victors yet, even though 4 columns, or 5, are advancing to take Madrid. According to Thomas, the 7th of October there were 10,000 troops ready for the assault with the Army of Africa, and 10,000 more under Mola in the north. The Republicans will try to establish an in-depth defense system with diverse concentric lines. But this was not going good, as the works for Madrid defense were far from ready. In the north of the capital, the Battle of Sigüenza seems near to its end, as the militia's leader leaves the city, and the militias, together with some civilians, retreat to the cathedral that will hold until next week. But the main punch, as said weeks ago, must come from the south, where the Army of Africa continues its advance. We can see here the progression of this week. Even though they are advancing, it's not at the same speed they used to have when they raced through Extremadura. Every inch of ground they take is paid in blood. The Republican lines are getting stronger. The Republic is throwing at them everything they have. We'll have to wait until next week to see how the offensive progresses. But a question arises in everyone's mind. Will the advance towards the capital stall? The second and third offensive of the week both take place in the surroundings of Oviedo, and both aim to end the siege. One to relieve the besieged force, one to exterminate it. We started our episode with a quote from the memoirs of one of the city's defenders. Back in the 19th of July, Aranda, the defender of Oviedo, even if a force of around 3,500 effectives, though most of them trained soldiers or civil guards, also had plenty of munitions and weapons. Mortars, 105mm mountain guns, 40mm Aragon cannons, 200 machine guns, 10,000 rifles, and 3 Trubia A4 tanks. And near the city there was Trubia Weapons and Ammunitions Factory. Being the epicenter of 1934 revolution, as you have seen, the city was provided with a strong and well-armed garrison. During the first days of the war, the defenders established an extended perimeter with 2 lines of defense in order to control the hills around the city. Since summer, the city was bombed by air and sea. The militias managed to gather more than 5 times the numbers of the defenders, but lacked weapons and ammunition, and had to deal also with the rebels of Gijón until they surrendered and with the coalition columns that were approaching from the west. But with the arrival last week of weapons and ammunition with the Republican fleet, they started to break the city's defenses. The 5th loyalist troops dislodged the defenders from the external perimeter, and by the 8th the advance continues. By tomorrow, Monday, the rebels will have to retreat to the city center. After months of siege, they had no ammunition, and in some places, hand-to-hand combat happens. But they can hear, to the west, the sounds of battle. The rebel column also started its offensive to relieve the city. The Republicans are pounded by the artillery, and the force, 90,000 strong and recently reinforced, ramps against the Republican lines, again and again, in order to relieve the city. We'll see the conclusion of this battle next week. So here's what happened during this week in the battlefields of Spain, but as always, much more happened in the rearguard. This week, a plan was put in motion to free José Antonio Primo de Rivera through bribes by the German consul in Aragon. Franco will boycott this operation on the grounds that Primo de Rivera's mental health could be poor. So, think about it. Primo de Rivera was a very charismatic man, and his arrival at the rebel headquarters could become a challenge to Franco. In fact, this same week, in an interview with J. Allen, José Antonio protested that it seemed the rebels were pushing a reactionary agenda, not a fascist one. In the Republican rearguard in Euskalherria, José Antonio Aguirre Lecube becomes Lehendakari, regional president. He is elected in a ceremony in the city of Guernica, swearing his charge under the Guernica tree, with the participation of all the council presidents that were able to attend. In Aragon, Spanish Ukraine, the Regional Defense Council of Aragon is created. It will rule over the loyalist-controlled Aragon. As said in previous episode, a libertarian revolution was going on there. If it was called the Spanish Ukraine, it was because it resembled the agricultural communities of Gulai-Pol during the Russian Revolution. We'll have time to talk about it deeper, but we have to keep in mind that we've just talked about 2 almost independent realities inside the Republican side, Euskalherria and Aragon, and the revolutionary process that is still tearing apart Republican-controlled territory. Meanwhile, last week, the rebels unified their command and leadership. Following the government aim of a progressive militarization of the militias, the 10th of October, the decree for the creation of the first mixed brigades is issued. The creation of the brigades will go into effect in a couple of weeks. Some historians, such as Esdale, consider that the decision of choosing the mixed brigade as the base unit for the Republic could be a mistake. The Mixed Brigade was an independent and self-sufficient unit. As you can see in the picture, it had anything it needed, from transmissions to artillery, recon elements, cavalry. We have to know that it was the ideal Mixed Brigade. Most of them did not have all of these elements. Even if we can consider the Mixed Brigade as an innovative idea, most of the armies nowadays are based on Mixed Brigades. Spain already had two of them, mountain brigades, and this organization was chosen to resemble the mobile columns that took part in the Rif War. Independent units, huge mobility, and with combat capability. The problems linked to this choice are twofold. First one, the fast-moving war, the Columns War, is near its end. We've seen the African army advancing at great speed through Extremadura, but in the last weeks, Republican resistance has intensified and the rebel advance are getting slower. In the north, the siege of Oviedo and the advance of the Galician columns had become a war of positions. This happens also in the Aragonese front and the Cordoba front, where there's not that much activity right now. The second problem is tied to the complexity of this kind of military unit. It needs special officers, NCOs, and Spain still had a huge illiteracy problem that it carried on its back since the 19th century. And at the beginning of the war, the government disbanded the army. The Republic, which allegedly had 3,500 of the 15,000 officers Spain had at the beginning of the war, will suffer from lack of trained and capable officers and NCOs during the whole war. And this situation will worsen as time goes on. So the choice of a mixed brigade, a unit that needed extra officers and NCOs, maybe was not the best choice. Right now on the international stage, this week we'll see how the Labour Party approved a motion where it states that fascist Italy and Nazi Germany are not respecting the non-intervention agreement. Also in this line, the 7th of October, the Russian Charge of Affairs in London declares that the USSR will declare itself free from any compromise with the non-intervention committee if the continuous violations don't stop. According to Thomas, Russian ships with war material had already departed from Odessa the 4th of October. Apart from that, we must note that since the 15th of August, the Republic received 74,000 tons of oil from the USSR. That was according to the Spanish-Russian agreement of 1933. That meant that the USSR was the oil provider for Spain. This agreement was cancelled by the Cedas-backed government of 1934-1935, but re-established when the Popular Front came to power in early 1936. With this note about oil and the incoming Russian war material, plus 3 ongoing offensives, we end the week. As always, if you missed last week's episode, here's the link. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. If you enjoyed it, share it. We have to bring light to the history of Spain. If you're able to support us in our Patreon channel, as these heroes already did, or offer us a coffee, this would also be great and would help us to carry on and improve the project. Let's make this possible together. Thanks for your attention, goodbye and salute.